Now I'd like to welcome to the show Jack McPherrin, research fellow at the Heartland Institute, who is here today to tell us all about ESG. Welcome, Jack.
Thanks, Richard. Good to be here.
So, so we've got a big topic today in the corporate world, what we call ESG or environmental, social, and governance investing. We've definitely talked about this before on the show with some of our previous guests, including my old buddy Russ Green from Stand Together. Um, and one of the first things you learn about this topic is that there are a lot of different definitions floating around. So why don't you give our listeners the definition that you think is right?
Sure, and I can pretty much just quote directly from a large policy paper that I just published a few months ago. But the best way I could describe it is this: so, at its core, ESG is a social credit scoring system that ideologically aligned elites and bureaucratic authorities have been developing to completely reset the entire global financial system to their advantage and fundamentally transform society in the process. It's a pretty large scale endeavor. And this is basically accomplished by altering traditional frameworks of evaluating businesses and assessing investment risk. Rather than determining the creditworthiness and the value of a business or industry based upon objective measures such as profit, ROI, consumer demand, and other material performance measures, ESG's architects seek to judge entities based upon subjective and difficult to quantify social and environmental objectives. And these objectives typically have little or nothing to do with business success in the marketplace based on consumer demand expressed through their purchases. And then entities that are, of course, deemed unworthy, such as those involved in hydrocarbon extraction, firearm manufacturing, or agricultural production, are just completely frozen out of financial markets. They're limited in their access to investment, loans, insurance policies, basic access to financial services, and more, which completely limits their growth potential. And these companies die in the vine unless they get in line. And yeah, I mean that's what it is at its core. It has material issues with it in terms of shareholders and investors getting less return on investment when they invest in ESG. But I would say that the more concerning aspect is normative in terms of the just immense power centralization that is happening, where we're essentially seeing a system that very closely resembles fascism, in which a cabal of massive corporate multinational corporations and Wall Street tycoons work with international organizations like the UN and the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and sovereign governmental regulatory authorities such as those under the Biden administration, like the SEC and the OCC, to force their ESG policies through.
Well, that is a great overview. There's a lot to get into there. And I know when I've talked about this in the past, people have said that, oh, well, this sounds like some kind of big conspiracy theory. The New World Order is taking over, and where's the like tangible examples of all of this stuff happening? And so certainly when it comes to government policy, the part I'm more worried about, obviously there's two big parts here: what corporate CEOs and decision makers are doing, and then what government policymakers are doing. We don't have to worry about predicting that something like this might happen in the future. It's things like this have already happened in the past. So when Obama was president, we had a policy, not publicly announced policy, later became sort of a scandal, called Operation Choke Point, where people in the Treasury Department and, as you mentioned, the Office of Control of the Currency, one of those financial regulators that most Americans probably have never even heard of, got to do with banks. And other federal regulators got together and said, "Oh, we actually don't like certain types of businesses. We just don't like them. Some of that, maybe they're gun shops, maybe they're the people that sell used gold coins." There's several different sort of subsets of usually small independent business people that people in the Treasury and other government agencies said they decided they just didn't like payday lenders. They don't like payday lenders. So they went to banks who they directly regulate. Right there, these are the big government officials that determine whether your bank stays in business or not. And they said, oh, you know what? Well, you got some of these clients here that have business checking accounts with you, and they're kind of shady. We don't like them very much. So maybe it'd be better for you if you just cut off their accounts and didn't have them as customers anymore. So if you're a $1 billion bank and an assistant secretary of the treasury comes into your office and tells you this, banking's a pretty highly regulated industry. You're probably just going to say, you know what, we're going to cancel those 100 gun shops and payday lenders and just move on, right? Forget about them. So we've and a lot of what ESG now is ESG policy and ESG scoring, like you said, is like a social credit score where if you have a business or business is doing business in a way that government officials like, you get a high score and people like you. If you're doing business in a way that people in power don't like, you get negative points and you get penalized. This kind of thing has already happened. People didn't call it ESG back then; they probably called it something else. But we have already tangible examples, and the only reason why we sort of really know about this is because Republicans in the House basically heard about it and then held some hearings about it and raised hell about it. And eventually those policies were sort of officially walked back. And if you ask people today if the agencies are still doing that, they'd say, "Oh no, of course we're not doing that." But where they're sort of doing it on an even bigger, less apologetic scale today. And so I just want to put that out there that some people who don't have a lot of direct contact with this think this sounds sort of fanciful or conspiratorial. And not only is it happening now, it's literally already happened before. So we
Yes.
shouldn't, don't put your skeptic hat on too tight because you might keep actual thoughts from going through your brain. This is something that is very much real. And as you said, entire individual firms, but entire industries are being squeezed out of credit markets and things like that. That going to create potentially all sorts of problems going forward. So your big study you did that came out earlier this year, ESG score is a threat to individual liberty, free markets, in the U.S. economy. It's long, it's detailed. People should go to Heartland's website and read the whole thing. But if they do not, we can give a quick run through the important topics you cover in there.
Sure.
So there's 5 big themes here. We can start with the history. So you're right. There's been this is a quote, a gradual elimination of individual freedom and privacy rights as part of ESG's development. Where did that all come from? What's the real short version of the history here of this sort of centralized control of what should be a market economy?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you can go all the way back to the founding of our country and the creation of the first major national bank under Alexander Hamilton, to go to the very beginning. But I would say that one of the biggest beginning points for this was the U.S. Federal Reserve, and then in 1913, and then the creation of the United Nations and the Bretton Woods institutions after World War II, and then of course the relinquishment of the gold standard, which changed our currency into complete fiat currency in under Nixon. And that also coincided with an increasing desire for corporations to act responsibly, and that coalesces with the concept of corporate social responsibility, which became highly popular in the latter half of the 20th century, which essentially holds that corporations should work in the interest of the public welfare, whatever that is deemed to be. And then ESG grew out of that. I believe that the first instance that the term ESG was used was in a report published by the United Nations in 2004 called "Who Cares Wins?" And then shortly thereafter, ESG became institutionalized, essentially. And the first major initiative was the group called the Principles for Responsible Investment. And it started off slow, but since then it has exponentially expanded. Let me find the actual numbers now. Yeah, at its inception in 2006, PRI's membership was comprised of 63 financial institutions businesses and government-related funds with approximately $6.5 trillion in assets under management. In 2022, its members controlled more than 100 trillion in assets under management. And that just goes to show how much money is invested in this space. To give you another interesting statistic, by the end of 2022, ESG assets have totaled a staggering $55 trillion. And by 2025, they're projected to nearly double to 96 trillion, which would represent 58.2% of global assets. And these are numbers that have been published by Deloitte. And so even though there has been a significant amount of pushback against ESG in the past year, especially since Congress has begun to take note, a lot of the pushback started at the state level, and states have been very focused upon enacting legislation and regulatory policies to prevent public pension funds from using their investors' funds to invest in ESG assets. But a lot of those laws, again, are very focused on the pecuniary aspects, and those are important. But what we really need is legislation that will eliminate discrimination against individuals in business based on ideological factors. And Florida recently enacted legislation that does that. And to draw from what you were saying earlier about how this is happening, I don't know if you saw the story about how Dr. Joseph Mercola a couple of weeks ago, who is a prominent vaccine skeptic and COVID-19 skeptic and everything, he had his and his family's and his entire business's bank accounts shut down for absolutely no reason by JP Morgan Chase. And now, from what we hear, he is going to appeal based on or sue based on the new statute that has been passed by Florida and Governor DeSantis. But yeah, what we need is work to continue to be done at the state level. But for this to really take off, we need to continue to push this at the federal level. And unfortunately, with the partisan makeup of our government currently, even though ESG, frankly, shouldn't be a partisan issue, I think Democrats and Republicans can all agree that this level of power centralization is damaging to everyone, and to democratic institutions, to individual liberty, to national security, you name it. But it's become a lightning rod left versus right issue, and I think that's a mistake. But that's just the way that the world works, sadly.
Well, yeah, and the question about finance and money decisions being weaponized ideologically for one direction or the other, like you said, it probably, this shouldn't be a partisan or ideological issue. We should all want a financial system that treats people equally and fairly. So, I mean, some people would look at, the debanking of a vaccine skeptic and say, well, that's great, because I believe in vaccines, and I believe in the NIH policy, and I support all that. So it's probably good that he's probably peddling misinformation anyway. But obviously, a situation that can debank the person you don't like can obviously debank the person you do like, when power and influence twists in a different direction, right? So we, it's like that the old movie about Henry VIII and his chancellor, where A Man for All Seasons, where they say, oh, would you give the devil the sake of the law, the due process of the law, if it were the devil himself? And the response is, well, yes, I would, if only just to protect myself. We would want to protect due process and individual rights and property rights, not because we think the other guy is the greatest guy in the world, but for the freedom and protection of everyone in society, right? So when it comes to topics like this, we get hung up on things like when it comes to like ESG things that corporations are supposed to do to be sort of ESG compliant or to have a good ESG score. They're supposed to do things like have diversity policies or decarbonization policies, related to climate change and all these things. And so sometimes we end up arguing about those sort of sub issues about like, well, what's your position on climate change? Well, what's your decision on diversity, equity, and inclusion, so-called DEI policies, or trans healthcare, or all these other things. That's not the point. The point is
Exactly.
that no one should have the power to weaponize the financial system to push you in any direction to begin
Right.
with. And like I said, if you think that like vaccine skeptics are being debanked today, the trans healthcare advocates could be debanked tomorrow, right? There's no reason why you think you're why you and your friends will always be on the right side of that equation.
Exactly.
So we'll get to, so we're doing our 5-part series here. So the history was the first part. Second, you're right about how ESG metrics have been used to favor some industries and discriminate against others. That's not so much viewpoint discrimination necessarily, but picking winners and losers, industry by industry. How does that play out?
Sure. So basically, if you are involved in hydrocarbon extraction, and let me find the actual section in the paper in which I go through this, because there's a few interesting quotes here. Yeah, here's a great one. For instance, in Texas, Brigham Minerals executive chairman Bud Brigham testified under oath in front of the Texas Senate Committee on State Affairs that Credit Suisse, which is a major Wall Street bank, refused to offer him a loan unless he publicly supported the bank's climate agenda. As reported by the Daily Caller, when he reached out to ask why Credit Suisse had failed to respond to his application, Brigham claims that a representative at Credit Suisse said the bank might not be able to partner with Brigham, allegedly telling him that climate change is real and it's not debatable. Brigham claims he responded that the science is ever evolving, prompting the representative to offer an opportunity to strike a deal, but only if Brigham parroted the bank's climate agenda. How about if I can get you some bullets to tweet? If you can tweet this out, I think there's a good chance that we can do this deal, the representative allegedly said. Brigham said he then received an email with the bullet points. So this is how they operate. And just in general, so they're trying to choke off investment from coal, oil, and natural gas extraction. They're trying to choke off investment of to farmers that don't change their practices to be more sustainable, even though they already have razor thin profit margins. And now the government is essentially trying to bribe farmers with even more subsidies to test out these practices. And okay, let's see here. According to a global fossil fuel divestment commitments database, by March 2023, 1,559 institutions worth approximately 40.5 trillion had committed to full or partial hydrocarbon divestment. So basically what happens is a lot of these companies that are involved in these, undesirable industries, they know that their only choice is to comply because companies need investment, they need loans, they need insurance policies. And if they don't get in line, all of those services are taken away. So it's either die or comply. And that's how this works. And right now, obviously, the focus of ESG is on environmental, social, and governance factors. But the point is that this is an infinitely malleable system. Mm-hmm. This is a system that is controlled by a very, very small group of elites at the top, whether they're political elites, cultural elites, economic elites, and they determine the metrics, and the metrics can change, and they have changed over time, and they will continue to change. I mean, who's to say that tomorrow they'll say that being an organization that is pro-life will no longer be able to receive investment? Who's to say that tomorrow an organization that is is in favor of the Second Amendment, is no longer is no longer able to receive investment or lending, and it could go the other direction too. I mean, it can go any direction. That's the point, is that this is a system of complete control. This is the essence of a command economy. This is we're not quite at the level that, for example, the Soviet Union was, but this is the first step towards that.
Well, like you said, this is sort of like in the direction of a fascist economy. Now, if we that the F word is very triggering and very melodramatic, so we can say economists and political theorists also use the word corporatism.
Yeah,
maybe that's like less
that's a better word for it. Yes,
but the idea that the government and a small handful of people in the private economy basically get together in a room and decide how the entire economy is going to operate. So in like fascist Italy under Mussolini, they had these sort of like industry guilds, and back then at the time, when there was labor unions were a much bigger force in all the industrialized countries. It was really sort of like a three-legged stool approach, where you would have the government economic planners in the room, and then you would have the organized labor people. They would be sort of in charge of corralling the entire workforce, and then you would have the handful of CEOs or industry association honchos in there, and they would just sort of sit down at a table and divide things up. Right, this is how the economy is going to be. You get the permits to operate in this industry, and then we're going to give the like union guy some guarantees he can take back to his people. You get so many jobs and so many raises, and this sort of cabal, corporatist cabal,
yes,
basically decides how the entire economy is going to be run. So that is not in the spirit of American democracy and constitutionalism and government, although it has been popular in Europe. So you have the worst version, which is the pre-World War II version in places like Italy and Germany, where they had outright fascist control, and they were proud of the fact that the central government controlled everything. You have the post-World War II version in a place like West Germany, where it was definitely not a fascist system, but it was still it was more of a corporatist type of system, where you, again, had leaders of companies, leaders of labor unions, and economic planners basically slicing up the economy in ways that they thought would, according to them, would play out well. That's never been part of the American system. So, part of my version of talking about this stuff is, I don't think it's a good idea in the first place to have these systems. Now, of course, it's at an international level where things are going according to the UN Sustainable Development Goals and things like that. And it's an international framework rather than a national framework. It's country by country. But one, I don't think this is a good idea in the first place. I don't think any country should embrace this system and say we're going to submerge our national economic interests and the interests of individual firms to this big international framework of ESG business. But even if other countries decide to do it, the United States especially should not do this.
exactly.
If for no other reason than it's unconstitutional and it's not how we make our laws in this country, right? So in other places, you could say, well, part of this is a sort of redistributionist idea, which is that imagine if we're like UN policymakers, part of the idea is, we want to balance things out, and we don't want the big rich countries to take all the advantages in the modern economy, so we're going to like try and implement all these rules to sort of kind of steer profits and economic development towards our poorer cousins that don't have as much. Obviously, with the US as being the largest economy in the world, that is also not in our favor. Right.
Exactly.
Where the idea that somehow our economic success is going to be redistributed to the rest of the world and all the other countries of the world by a international policymaking organization. And one other thing, when you mentioned Credit Suisse, I thought that was really interesting, because one of the other criticisms here that I've heard, I'm sure you've heard plenty, is that and there's economists and management business school professors who have studied this have said, actually, it is not uncommon for companies that have ethics problems of their own to try and cover that up by virtue signaling in an ESG direction, by saying, oh, well, don't look at our books. just look at our press release about this great enlightened progressive ESG policy we've
Yeah.
announced. Credit Suisse, of course, went bankrupt, was bought by UBS, and so it's sort of no longer a player on the field anymore. But people who know the history of that company know that it had had many big dramatic ethics scandals going back a few decades, multiple times, where they were doing things like evading taxes for their private wealth clients, things like that. And so it should not come as any surprise, of course. It's only to be expected that a company that has a legitimately shady reputation, because it has in fact been, its people have been convicted of doing actual tangible shady things, would be at the forefront of embracing this sort of reputation laundering via ESG, right? Because if we can get people to stop remembering that felonious stuff we did a few years ago with our new enlightened policy, then of course that's exactly who's going to jump on this.
Yes.
So moving along, we have, so big topic 3, you describe various groups of people who are responsible for creating and promoting these ESG policies. Again, like you said, we're not quite to the Soviet Union central planning stage quite yet. So, but there are sort of overlapping groups of people, both in government and in corporate America, who are working on this stuff. How does that play out? How do people in Geneva or New York City at the United Nations, how do they interface and work with the people in, say, Washington, D.C., who are the policy people?
Well, it's kept fairly shadowy by design. It's not like all these people congregate in some corporate boardroom and make decisions, like for example, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It's not like the Central Committee or something. A lot of it is done by coercion, but the 5 primary groups of actors, and of course there are more, such as credit ratings agencies and proxy voting companies like ISS and Glass Lewis. But the 5 primary boxes that I would say these individuals belong to are international organizations like the United Nations, the World Economic Forum. Of course, Klaus Schwab is perhaps the most famous and effective leader who has, and I say effective in quotes, of course, has championed ESG. And then we've got, like I said before, Bretton Woods institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. We've got the Bank of International Settlements. And then those are just a few examples. But their role is essentially to fund a lot of these efforts through their nonprofit coffers, and to organize private sector actors under their auspices, like for example the Glasgow Alliance, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and its subsidiaries like the Net Zero Asset Managers Alliance, the Net Zero Banking Alliance, the Net Zero Insurance Alliance, which leads me to the next few actors, which are asset managers, banks, and insurance companies. So asset managers, the big 3 asset management companies are BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, with BlackRock perhaps being the most notorious, with Larry Fink being just as much of an ardent champion of ESG as Klaus Schwab is, although Larry, as of the past few months, has decided to stop using the term ESG because he says it's being politicized. That does not, of course, mean that he is not still promoting ESG. He's just trying to not get as much flack sent in his direction. But these 3 asset management firms control approximately 22 trillion in assets between them, as well as an average of 20% of the shareholder votes in the S&P 500. One instance in which BlackRock is notorious for using its coercive power is they organized a takeover of ExxonMobil's board of directors in 2021, replacing 3 of its 12 directors with climate activists, committing to moving Exxon away from hydrocarbon-based energy production and sales, which is insane considering that ExxonMobil is a hydrocarbon extraction company. And because of the enormous amount of capital and the votes that they have, they're, most companies have no choice but to fall in line with these ESG practices if they want to stay solvent. And then, the next big group, of course, is banks. Bank of America's Brian Moynihan is perhaps the most another of the most notorious ESG advocates. He also chairs the International Business Council, which is a World Economic Forum affiliated organization that is comprised of, I don't know how many, but I think over 100 of like the top business leaders in the world. And they basically use their combined wealth and influence to prohibit general services and lending to business that are deemed to be lacking in ESG adherence. And they've also been found to offer services or capital conditionally, and to give preferential treatment to companies with higher ESG ratings. There's a report that Morningstar released in 2021 saying most major banks screen their lending practices against specific ESG risks, and many embrace negative or positive screening for potential corporate lending transactions or project finance transactions. Negative screening and norm-based screening involve the exclusion or avoidance of transactions not aligned with environmental, social, and ethical standards. So, and yes, this is happening. It will continue to happen. And it's not just for companies. It's going to start happening to individuals, and already has, such as in the case of Dr. Mercola. If you express certain speech, if you express your First Amendment right to a certain political viewpoint, that can be used to debank you under this system. I mean, this system, again, offers infinite control. And so that's the essentials of how the banks work. And then the insurance corporations operate very similarly. They promote ESG causes by refusing to underwrite policies for organizations that don't toe the ESG line. Large insurance companies like AXA, Alliance, and Zurich have refused to service clients. They refuse to commit to sustainable practices. Some of these efforts have been scaled back slightly in the face of antitrust concerns. For example, AXA and Alliance recently left the Net Zero Insurance Alliance because of some of the flack and heat that they've been getting. I don't think that they are reducing their ESG crusade much, but they're trying to remove themselves from the association with the alliance because there are legitimate concerns about antitrust violations. Overall, 30 of the world's largest insurance companies, representing 15% of the world's premium volume, had signed on to the Net Zero Insurance Alliance. And that's just as important as, it's a little bit more in the weeds, but it's just as important as the asset managers and the financial institutions, and the three work in concert. And so the fifth major grouping would be regulatory authorities. And specifically in the United States, this involves, and has involved, at least under the Biden administration, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the Department of Labor, and the Securities and Exchange Commission. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, actually under the Trump administration, had proposed a new rule prohibiting category-based discriminatory practices based on the fair access principles ensconced within the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. The rule had stated, consistent with the Dodd-Frank Act's mandate of fair access to financial services, and since at least 2015, the OCC has repeatedly stated that while banks are not obligated to offer any particular financial service to their customers, they must make the services they do offer available to all customers, except to the extent that risk factors particular to an individual customer dictate otherwise. This was at the very end of the Trump administration's tenure. And of course, within the first few days of the Biden administration taking office, they paused that rule, and it has not been revived since, because the Biden administration has been very much in favor of ESG, which leads me to the Department of Labor. On November 22nd, 2022, the Secretary of Labor announced a new rule titled Prudence and Loyalty in Selecting Plan Investments and Exercising Shareholder Rights. And describing it, the Secretary stated, today's rule clarifies that retirement plan fiduciaries can take into account the potential financial benefits of investing in companies committed to positive environmental, social, and governance actions as they help plan participants make the most of their retirement benefits. Removing the prior administration's restrictions on plan fiduciaries will help American workers and their families as they save for a secure retirement, which is, of course, hogwash. So that's happened. And I would say the SEC, though, is perhaps the most dangerous, and they've proposed 3 new rules which have yet to be formalized, although talk on the street is that they will be formalized by the end of this year. And the most impactful of the 3 ESG related rules is the climate rule, which would authorize an unprecedented method of risk assessment and impose financial disclosures related to climate change policies for all SEC listed companies. Among other things, the rule would, and I'm quoting from the paper, require registrants to include certain climate related disclosures in their registration statements and periodic reports, including information about climate related risks that are reasonably likely to have a material impact on their business, results of operations, or financial condition, and certain climate-related financial statement metrics in a note to their audited financial statements. The required information about climate-related risks also would include disclosure of a registrant's greenhouse gas emissions, which have become a commonly used metric to assess a registrant's exposure to such risks. They have the SEC chairman, Gary Gensler, has recently indicated that he might be willing to relax the policy slightly due to a ton of public and corporate backlash, but whether that occurs is yet to be determined. But the SEC formalizing this rule would essentially homogenize our ESG practices with what entities like the European Union have done. I mean, it would institutionalize ESG within our financial system. Largely the ESG efforts have been coming from international organizations, but if the SEC does this, it becomes formalized within the U.S. economy, and it most likely will happen.
Well, yeah, one of these things that I think comes up all the time, that I always I always wonder about, where you have all of these institutional efforts trying to push people away from, for example, investing in oil and gas, or even like in the case of the SEC rule you talked about, trying to push people away from investing in a company that even uses a lot of energy. That oil and gas, fossil fuels, hydrocarbons, whatever you want to call them, still fuel about 80% of our economy and the entire world's economy. So it seems like some of our friends in the ESG advocacy space have not really thought this through exactly. It would be one thing if you go back to some earlier generations of ethical investing guidelines, back then it was just people who didn't want to invest in like defense contractors that made weapons for the Pentagon, or sometimes they would say, well, we don't want to invest in companies that make cigarettes because we don't like cigarettes, and the smoke and the nicotine's bad for you. It would be one thing if you said, well, we're not going to invest in any cigarette companies. In fact, we hope they go bankrupt, right? Well, I think it should be legal to make any product that is itself legal. And I think, it should be legal to make cigarettes. You could at least imagine a world where there weren't any cigarettes, right? Like there's not a cigarette industrial complex, with the exception possibly of some, transactions in prisons, that would, no important part of our society would collapse if people stopped smoking cigarettes. If all oil and gas disappeared tomorrow, our entire society would collapse overnight, right?
Yes, it would.
And we've had decades of advocates for wind and solar, renewable energy, trying to like nudge and push us in the direction of more renewables, and it's been slow going, right? Over 40 plus years. When this started, we were doing it because of the Arab oil embargo. And that's why during the Carter administration, the federal government started ramping up and saying, well, we got to get serious about wind and solar. Then it became about climate change, and it was sort of the same policies for different reasons. But the ramping up of wind and solar has been has been kind of slow, which means that even if these ESG policies were wildly more successful than they have been so far, and it turns out, well, we did it, kids. We put ExxonMobil out of business. They're gone, right? No more oil and gas. What situation would that leave us with? And it obviously would not be a great one, right? Because we're so dependent on those affordable, transportable, power dense sources of energy. So that I think leaves a lot of unanswered questions on the part of the people who are advocating in this direction, right? So if we, the people who are kind of pushing back on this, if we just stepped away and they won everything, I think they would be like the dog who caught the car, right? They wouldn't quite know what to do with that victory because it would come with a lot of very negative consequences, which is just one of the many problems with this framework in general, is that it's pushing towards, in the words of its advocates, one of their favorite words, it's an unsustainable goal. Right?
Yes.
So we have covered all sorts of great stuff, and we could go on for 2 hours, Jack.
We could go on for 2 decades probably. Yeah.
But we're gonna well, let's wrap up. And we have the pushback, like you said, that has been happening recently in Congress, but also someone at the state level. Can you give us a quick wrap up on who's out there pushing back on this sort of economic centralization ESG agenda? Who should we be looking at?
Well, the people pushing, the pushback is happening, from think tanks such as Heartland and CEI and Heritage. But in terms of our elected representatives, yes, the states have done a very good job of taking notice of this and passing legislation. Florida, for example, has probably signed the most expansive anti-ESG, or DeSantis has signed probably the most expansive anti-ESG legislation to date. We have a map on page 34 of the paper, but so far, Utah, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Texas, Louisiana, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Florida had enacted ESG policies as of the publication of the paper. And then another 5 states, Idaho, Montana, Nebraska, Iowa, New Hampshire, have policies that are likely to soon be enacted. And then there are a number of other states in which anti-ESG policy has been proposed. In some states that policy has failed. In some states, it's still under consideration. Of course, state legislative sessions are usually only for a few months at the beginning of the year. So a lot of this work is going to be done in early 2024 or continued in early 2024. But what we really need, and what we've seen, is that we need this to be championed at the federal level as well. And like I mentioned before, unfortunately, due to the partisan makeup of our government, we're probably not going to be able to enact any federal policy with such a razor-thin margin in the House, and with us not controlling the Senate or the White House, or with conservatives that seem to be the only party or the only ideological group that opposes ESG, even though they shouldn't be. They are. There needs to be a significant electoral shift in order for any significant federal anti-ESG action to occur. But luckily, July has been termed ESG month by congressional Republicans, and there have been a number of bills proposed by a number of congressmen and or representatives and senators. Of course, they have not gone very far because they don't stand a chance of passing. One was passed. It's the let's see here, what's it called specifically? It was a bill introduced by Andy Barr, a representative from Kentucky, that would protect American investors from having their retirement plans used for ESG practices, and it did pass, but it did pass Congress, but President Biden used his first veto to nip that in the bud. So at the federal level, we probably need a little bit more time for that to work, but the greatest value I think from it is just raising awareness and getting the public to understand the threat that this poses, because then they can put into office people that are going to do something about it.
All right, excellent. So, tell us, where can we find this paper? Where can we find your commentary? Where can we find you on social media?
Sure. Well, I don't personally have social media, but on on heartland.org, if you go to our ESG page, just go to www.heartland.org/ESG. You can find the full paper. It's at the top of the page, and a number of other policy tip sheets that I've created, and a whole bevy of legislative testimonies and op-eds that we've written, and longer form publications. And yeah, I would recommend that you check it out, and we'll keep adding to the page as we keep fighting against this.
All right, thanks.